American government, representative government. When the delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to write the United States Constitution, they had a number of factors to take into account. The first was that the states had their own governments already and intended to keep those governments. The states also differed greatly in terms of relative size and wealth. Powerful states like Virginia and New York were not interested in joining a union that failed to recognize their prominent place within that union. Conversely, small states like Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations and Delaware were not interested in creating a new nation where their interests could be easily pushed aside. There was also a question about the role the people themselves would play in this new country. Under the United States' first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, members of Congress were chosen and represented by the states themselves. That would not work under a new constitution. The national government under the Constitution would have the power to tax the people. As such, the people would need a direct voice at the federal level of government, not just an indirect one. These considerations were resolved by what has come to be called the Great Compromise, the decision to create a two-chambered or bicameral Congress. The House would be much bigger and have proportion representative to each state's population elected by the voters to just 2-year terms. This arrangement satisfied the larger states. They would have a bigger share of the House seats relative to their population. It also served to satisfy the interest that the people would have a direct role in electing their representatives. The people would send members to the House. In contrast, the Senate would have 2 members per state, officially chosen by the state legislatures for 6-year terms. This arrangement satisfied the concerns of the small states. They would have an equal representation in the Congress by way of this Senate. It also mollified those who wanted the states to have a say in the selection of federal officials. State interests would still figure into the method of choosing the president, since the states would be free to choose the means by which they elected their U.S. senators. Calls to directly elect the president were rejected repeatedly at the convention. Similarly, a proposal to have Congress choose the president was also rejected. It was widely understood that such methods would have weakened the president's ability to act with good judgment against the voting majority and fulfill his or her duty to act as a check against the Congress. The framers thus invented what has come to be called the Electoral College. Each state would have as many electors as it had members of the House and members of the Senate. So number of House seats plus 2 is the number of electors each state would have. The electors were not the representatives themselves. The state legislatures would choose their own independent electors, and the candidate with a majority of these state electoral votes would become United States president. Thomas Jefferson was 3,000 miles away when the Constitution was being written, serving as U.S. ambassador to France. He admired many of the Constitution's features, particularly its separation of powers. But Jefferson was worried that the people had been given too little power under this new Constitution. Jefferson also thought officials should be term limited, not a feature of the original Constitution. If not, office holders might come to believe that public office was theirs by right. Other critics noted the contrast between the Constitution's provisions and what the states were actually doing. In nearly all states, governors and legislators were chosen by direct popular vote. So why should the national government be any different? In defending the Constitution's provisions, the framers argued that the history of unrestrained democracies was a history of tyranny, or ruled by tyrants, where the many trampled on the rights of the few. Said James Madison, "Pure democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." The framers even had a homegrown example, Rhode Island, to point to that showed America, if not careful, could also fall into democratic despotism. In that state, debtors had gained control of the state legislature and had concocted a scheme for getting rid of their debt. They passed a law authorizing the use of paper money within the state, which was largely worthless, to pay debts incurred by borrowing gold. Creditors were hunted down, tied up in public places, and people lined up to pay off their debts with the worthless paper money. Soon the Rhode Island economy was a wreck, with inflation running at extremes. Most of its shops had shut down, and creditors had fled the state. The Boston newspaper labeled the state Rogue Island. Understanding their history well, the framers were concerned of the dangers of unrestrained democracy and faithfully committed the American nation to a republican form of government. The people would have a voice in government, but it would be filtered through representative institutions, only one of which, the U.S. House of Representatives, would be subject to direct election by the people. The The Constitution, said Madison, was a Republican remedy for the ills of uncontrolled democracy. Because men are not angels, pure democracy would inevitably lead to something worse than anarchy, mob rule by the majority, and a trampling on the rights and fundamental freedoms of those who disagree with the majority. By design, then, the wealthy and the prominent in this new country would play a critical role in supporting and advancing the strength of this new government. Through the first 6 presidents, very few small farmers, craftsmen, or merchants were elected to Congress or held any high-ranking executive positions. Rule by elites was upended with the election of the 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Raised in poverty by a widowed mother in the backwoods of Carolina, Jackson won national fame as commanding general at the Battle of New Orleans, where U.S. forces defeated the British in the War of 1812. Jackson appointed ordinary citizens to executive office and pressured states to eliminate their property ownership as a requirement for voting. He persuaded the states to tie their Electoral College votes for the presidency to their own state popular vote indirectly. Jackson's system is the one we have today. The winner of a state's popular vote receives its electoral votes, giving the voters a decisive say in the choice of the president. Critics of the Electoral College today minimize its democratic evolution, as well as its role as representative of state interests at the federal level. Other pro-democracy forces have carried the day in the intervening decades after Jackson. After the Civil War, former slaves and the descendants of the slaves fought alongside American women for equal voting rights, protections that are now enshrined in constitutional amendments or additions to the Constitution after ratification. That is what the amendments are. There have only actually been 27 that have been ratified, including the 10 amendments comprising the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was also amended in the early 20th century by progressive party reformers to require the direct election of U.S. senators. Previously, the state legislatures generally chose a state's U.S. senators, giving them a shield against the winds of politics. It was that same reform impulse that succeeded in getting states to adopt primary elections where the voters, rather than the political party organizations, chose their party candidates. As you might have inferred, these changes basically undid the work of the framers. The presidency, House, and Senate were now all subject to the vote of the people, who now had 2 chances to be heard during an election cycle, once in the primary or caucus election, where they chose their candidates, and once in the general election, where parties competed against one another for office. At the beginning of the Republic, the people had a relatively focused voice in their governing. Today, as has been true ever since the progressive era of the early 20th century, the United States has more democratic elections for national office than any other nation in the world. Lots of elections doesn't mean that Americans vote all that often. In fact, as democracy has gradually written itself over top our Republican Constitution, fewer and fewer Americans vote. In fact, the United States has nearly the lowest voting rate among Western nations. Ongoing political polarization, concerns over districting, sometimes called gerrymandering, drawing up of districts to favor one party or the other. And even debates over voter ID laws now contribute to divisive electoral processes within the United States. But the issue runs far deeper than that. Here in the 21st century, in the place where human liberty was given a new birth of freedom, many people simply choose not to vote and remain ignorant of the scope and structure of the complicated but glorious history that rests on the shoulders of ordinary citizens like you. And that liberty is one we must defend, the fundamental right to abstain from voting. No one should be pressured to participate in our democracy, because free association is a fundamental American right. Among the natural rights given by God, protected by government, not given by government. But make no mistake about it, you are the cornerstone of the United States government, whether you choose to vote or not.